This lecture is going to introduce you to some of the tools and techniques that you need to be aware of whenever you're doing macro photography. Macro photography, contrary to its name, is not taking images of very large things. What it actually is it's taking images of very small things. Typically, a macro photography shot is an image that will be reproduced greater than a 1:1 ratio for production. So anytime you're going to take a picture of something and then scale it up so that it's larger than a 1:1, you are technically doing 1:1, or you're technically doing macro photography. Digital cameras are very well suited simply because with macro photography there's a lot of practice that needs to be done in order to be able to get a good shot. And of course with digital cameras you can take as many photos as you like until you get the result that you're looking for. Some of the digital cameras and the equipment that we can use with digital cameras can allow for some very, very close-up shots. This is just an example of a macro picture that a student has taken. This is a small coin that they took, and notice at how much detail you're actually able to see in this particular photograph. There's quite a few things that you'll need to remember whenever you're working in macro photography. First thing is to make sure that you keep your items, your equipment, and your work area clean. Small specks of dust or dirt or debris that are either on your camera lenses or on your studio space where you're working will show up, because what we're doing is we're magnifying those imperfections. So it's in our best interest to make sure that we keep everything clean before we start shooting. And then with the ISO, what we'll need to do is we'll need to increase our sensitivity just slightly. The reason why we need to make sure that we have our ISO increased is because the amount of light that we have with a macro image is going to be reduced. So whereas in studio photography we could have shot at an ISO of 100 or 200, we may end up having to increase a ISO number up to 400 or 800 to be able to get our camera to be able to get the amount of light that we need to be able to take a picture. As far as our aperture goes, there's two different thoughts here. The first one is that you need to use large f numbers, which means that you're going to use very, very small openings. And the reason for that is because your depth of field is going to drop off if you use a small f number. If you use something like a 1.8, you're going to have an incredibly shallow depth of field, and you're not going to get all the detail out of your image that you may be looking for. Larger f numbers are going to increase our depth of field for our macro photography. Also with focusing, because we're so close to a particular object, our automatic focus probably is not going to work for a majority of our pictures. So what we'll end up having to do is we'll have to put it into manual focus mode and then try to find that optimal focal length to be able to take a picture. And there's a technique that I use that whenever you're trying to do focusing with your SLR camera, and that is that the camera, of course, is going to be on a tripod to be able to keep it steady and to avoid any shake or anything like that. But what you'll also need to do is you may want to put your object on a piece of paper or on something where you can actually slide the object back and forth, because what you'll find out is that the very fine-tuned focusing on your camera may not be getting you the best results, and as soon as you take your hand off the camera it'll drop out of focus. But by using a piece of paper, putting your object on a piece of paper or some surface, you can actually slide the object back and forth without having to worry about the focus falling out from you touching your camera. Your compositions should fill the majority of the viewfinder. And that is, so to speak, that anytime you're composing an image, that you need to make sure that all of the images show up inside of the viewfinder. And then of course you're going to have very short depth of field. And as you're shooting your pictures, if you have something that you're going to be shooting flat, let's say you're going to be taking an overhead shot of a coin, you're going to find out that those are very easy to be able to take a picture of. However, if you have something that's going to be a longer image and you're going to try to shoot it lengthwise, so that you can get more depth of the object, you're going to find out that it's going to be difficult to work with simply because of the fact that there is such a short depth of field to begin with. So it doesn't matter how high you turn up your aperture setting, you still may end up with a shallow depth of field if you're trying to get all of an entire length of an object. One of the things that I find people try to do are objects like pencils or even toothpicks. They try to get a length shot of it, and they'll see that much of it falls out of focus very quickly whenever you're shooting in macro photography. So that's something that you have to be aware of, is your depth of field is amplified significantly in macro shooting. Your flash and your lighting, make sure that you are diffusing the light as much as you can, putting pieces of paper, putting diffusers over the top of the lights to be able to reduce the harsh highlights and shadows, because the harsh highlights and shadows that you get in macro photography can be very distracting to your overall subject and composition. And be prepared to shoot multiple images. You're going to find out that the very first time around, or even the second, or maybe even the 20th or 30th shot is not going to be your best work with macro photography, because there's so much that we have to be aware of and we have to pay attention to. We have a lot of work that we have to do whenever we are taking pictures. Now, with our macro photography, something that you should be aware of is that we've got a variety of different tools. And what happens in macro photography is that we are creating magnification, which is why we can see the objects or the details in the subject much more clearly. And with these different tools, there are different considerations and different ways for us to be able to understand how they work. Very first one is what we call a bellows. A bellows is kind of like what we may have seen on an old camera, but what we do is we take our camera itself, and then we take a lens, and then we put this device, which is the bellows, in between the camera and the lens. And what that does is it will create magnification. Much like a magnifying glass, if you hold it very close to your eye, and as you start to move it away from your eye gets bigger, the subject starts to appear bigger. Same thing happens with a camera. The problem with macro tools like a bellows is that they're big and bulky, so you'll need to put them on a tripod, and that you'll have to be incredibly close to your subject to be able to take a picture, oftentimes within a few inches to be able to take a picture using a bellows. Now, in addition to a bellows piece of equipment, there is also a tool called a macro lens, and they typically say macro on the side, and they work like any other ordinary lens. The difference is that what they'll do is they actually provide portability, and the portability means that you don't have to do anything else. You can just clip it onto the front of your lens and then go ahead and go to town and start shooting. What you'll find out though is, in order for you to be able to take a picture of a subject, you may sometimes have to be pretty far from the subject as they are. Some macro lenses, you may have to be in excess of 36 inches from your subject to be able to take a picture. So it's different from a bellows, where you have to be very close to your subject. With a macro lens, you have to have a great distance. But again, usually with a macro lens, there's some sort of a switch or a mode that you click on to be able to turn on to activate the macro photography. Something else that you could probably use whenever you're doing macro photography is you can utilize what's called a close-up lens. What a close-up lens does is it attaches to the front of your ordinary lens, and then it provides magnification of your subject through that lens. And close-up lenses are inexpensive. They're pretty easy to use. You can get a close-up lens kit for probably $40 or $50. And they've got pretty good sharpness with our small aperture, small lens openings. What you should be aware of though is that you'll get some distortion at the edges of your picture as a result of the lens, or as a result of the close-up lens. Another tool that's used in macro photography is what we call an extension tube. And the extension tube will go in between the camera and the lens, much like the Bellows, except they're not as big and bulky as a Bellows is. And they provide us better optical quality than our close-up lens that we had, or our Bellows. But one of the issues that we have is that they end up making our lens slower. That is, that we have to use slower shutter speeds to be able to get an adequate sharpness of a picture. Teleconverters are also accessories that you can put on your lens to increase the magnification of it. But with teleconverters, they can be very expensive if you were to go to purchase them, whereas close-up lens or a macro, or a close-up lens, maybe $40 or $50. Extension tubes are probably right around the same amount. Teleconverters are much more expensive. We also have issues with teleconverters where they don't change the lens closest focusing range, and they do reduce the maximum aperture of the lens, and that is that they cut the light, just like an extension tube does as well. Now, with macro photography, you'll have to have a lot of light. And keep in mind that your small objects can be covered by shadows very easily, even if it is your camera itself can be able to cast a shadow on an object. And we've got a lot of issues with depth of field and small aperture numbers. So that's part of the reason that we want to use lights quite a bit, so that we can open up that depth of field and we can use those really small aperture numbers like f20 and higher to be able to get adequate sharpness. As far as your lighting goes, all the lighting that you have available to you in portrait or product photography is available to you in macro photography. But keep this in mind, that if you are going to be using tungsten light bulbs, that you are going to need, they will give you plenty of light, but they get really, really hot, especially over time. I've been shooting in macro areas where I've been working on a camera for a while, and the camera starts to feel warm to touch, and I'm even sweating as I'm working around some of these lights. Fluorescent lights are a lot cooler, but you'll need quite a few of them to be able to get the results that you're looking for. And then LED is the exact same thing. They're a lot cooler, but you'll need quite a few of them to be able to get the equivalent results that you get out of a tungsten bulb. So with your lighting, make sure that you've got your white balance checked so that you get optimal results regardless of the situation that you're using. And a tripod is going to be very important for you whenever you're taking pictures as well, because with macro photography, even the tiniest vibrations in the camera can cause it to easily move and vibrate, and then you're going to lose sharpness out of your picture, which is why we typically use a tripod. Some other things that you'll want to make sure that you know how to do, or whenever you're taking macro pictures, is if you're able to use the camera's timer, the self-timer function, because by the time the timer goes off, you will have hopefully kept your hands or your head off the camera and let the camera be able to go ahead and take its picture. You can also use a remote trigger or a remote device if you have the capability on your camera to be able to trigger the shutter on the camera itself. A lot of cameras actually have the capability to buy like an infrared remote, or even the newest ones now have the capability of being able to utilize your smartphone to be able to trigger the camera's shutter release. Now, on your camera itself, the SLR camera, you do have a macro mode, which is for shooting tulips and small objects like that. If you're using a standard lens or a macro lens, what's going to happen is you might get okay results, okay? But most of the time, people, whenever they're shooting macro pictures, they have better results for going into manual mode, because what happens in manual mode is it allows you to be able to control the aperture, the shutter, and white balance and the ISO. So my honest opinion is that whenever you're taking macro pictures, especially utilizing some of the attachments and the tools and the techniques that we have available for you, do not use the macro mode. Utilize manual mode so that you have control of your aperture, your shutter, and your white balance. You're just going to get a lot better results if you do shoot in macro. So this summarizes much of what you'll need to know whenever you start to shoot or take pictures in macro mode for photography. Thank you.